Good morning friends. Today we are going to learn about the color fastness and its importance to the textile industry and as well as to the consumer also. The main objectives of today's topic are to understand the needs of the color fastness test, to understand the factors that are affecting the color fastness, to associate with the standard procedures for conducting the color fastness, and to acquire knowledge of evaluating color fastness. And here we are going to learn about the definition and the needs of the color fastness. One of the important attribute for a consumer while selecting the textile material, in fact a fabric or a dress, is color. Color makes the fabric bestseller in the market. So, it is very important for a textile manufacturer or a colorist to select the right color for the right textile end use, and as well as color leads the fashion cycle. So, obviously a consumer will buy and select clothes or any textile product based on the color. So, if anything goes wrong with the color and its selection and the procedures done while dealing with the color dyeing procedures, so obviously it results in a problem, that is a poor color fastness. Fastness of a color refers to its permanence or its ability to remain unchanged throughout the useful life of the article to which it has been applied. So, good color fastness means that a pigment or a dye which is applied onto the textile material need to remain in its original shape and consistency throughout the useful life of the product or the textile material. Textile products are being tested for different color fastness, that is generally washing, crocking, perspiration, sunlight, etc. But these are the important conditions for apparel and home textiles. A faded fabric, even though very strong and can withstand further wear and tear, it cannot be in a presentable form. So, color fastness is very important to the textile chemist or the designer or as well as to the consumer. Now, coloring agent is fast throughout for all the conditions. So, obviously some textile products may show or possess good color fastness for its laundering or washing, but at the same time it possesses poor fastness to sunlight. Until unless we do testing and under standard conditions, we cannot specify the particular color is fast or not. So, selection of a color is very important depending on the end use of the textile material. So, this is the greatest job for the textile chemist or a colorist to understand the end use of the product and finally select the color. Another problem generally associated with the poor color fastness is the transfer of color to the lighter material, maybe within the same fabric or to the adjacent fabrics. This generally happens while washing or wearing clothes. So, therefore, fastness should be viewed both in terms of color change that happens in the dyed material or the color material, or the color stain that happens to the adjacent materials. We will see what are the factors that generally affects the color fastness. The fastness of the dye or a pigment depends on the selection of a dye or a pigment suitable for the fabric. So, this is all depends on the selection of the fiber and the selection of the dye component that is used for dyeing. And variables in the color applications, that includes the category of the chemical structure of the fiber as well as the dye or the pigment, because both should go hand in hand. Addition of chemical auxiliaries that aid in the fixation of the color is also important, because these are the important factors that improve the fastness properties. The objective of the color textile based on the end use. As we seen this earlier, this is a very important factor finally that has to understand while dealing with the color fastness. The beauty of the fabric and its construction has no value to the consumer even though fabric is strong enough. Until unless its color remain permanent on it, people will never buy it. So, a manufacturer should understand the test procedures of color fastness, and after the fabric is being colored or dyed, it has to be undergone for this color fastness test or procedures. Now we are going to see the color fastness to the washing. Washing is the common treatment given to the textile materials that is meant for apparels. This washing treatment is given at home very commonly, but generally different types of textile materials like different fibers is given different washing procedures. So one has to understand what type of textile material it is and then follow the procedure for washing. So now we are going to see the common problem that is related with washing. So we might come across problems like bleeding. You might have observed that while washing clothes at home. So bleeding is nothing but running of color into the water while it is being washed. So this is a common problem we all face at home while dealing with the apparels. To overcome this, we have to understand the reasons why color bleed into the water. The reasons behind this bleeding are unfixed color on the surface of the dyed material. This is if the fixation of the color has not happened after dyeing onto the textile material, the tendency of the dye to run into the water. This is a very common problem. And the next reason is poor selection of the dye for a particular fabric. As we have discussed earlier, we have to select a proper class of the dye as per the requirement of the end use as well as the class of the fiber. So if affinity is not there, obviously the dye or a pigment has a tendency to run into the water. And the next reason is poor fastness of the dye category. Because there are different classes of the dyes and few dyes do have a poor fastness properties. So we have to avoid using such type of dye class. And the next one is improper method of dyeing. There are different methods of dyeing procedures that is being followed at textile industry while applying color to the textile products. So we have to select the right procedure for dyeing. So if you follow all these things, we can avoid bleeding. There are number of variations being used in testing the fabrics. As we have discussed just now, we have to see what type of fiber and what class of the dye that is being selected for these textile materials before it is being washed, and we also have to understand the end use of the product for which it is meant for. The important elements to be considered in performing washing tests are generally the washing temperature or the washing machine temperature has to be decided upon, because washing happening at the high temperatures make the dye to loosen from the textile material and run into the water. So this has to be taken into a consideration, and the time taken for washing is also important factor. So commonly we see such problems while soaking the material for a longer time and then washing results in a poor fastness property. Next one is addition of additives that is being used like soaps and alkalis while washing. For example, sodium carbonate, we commonly use it, which intensifies the washing property, also makes the dye to run into the water. So this has to be taken into consideration. Mechanical action which fabrics are subjected during laundering must be included in washing test, because too much of hesitation results in bleeding. The proportion of the liquor to the amount of material washed is also important factor in laundering. Now we are going to see the test procedures that generally followed in the standard conditions in the standard laboratories for color fastness to washing. Generally here they use a machine called laundrometer. A laundrometer is an automated machine or a semi-automated machine that is having some containers in which a test specimen, that is a colored sample, along with the adjacent fabrics are being washed together to see its color fastness in terms of color change and color staining. So the procedure is like this. A test specimen, that is a colored specimen or a colored sample of 10 into 4 centimeters has been prepared, and it is being sandwiched from both the sides using a undyed or a white material. Generally a cotton material on one side and a silk fabric on other side has been stitched on the either side of the colored material, and the test specimen is now being placed into the laundrometer, and then washing procedure takes place. For this, a wash liquor is being created by adding 5 grams of neutral soap to 1 liter of water, that is a distilled water, and then this wash liquor is being added into the container having the test specimen, and this procedure takes place at 40 degrees plus or minus 2 degrees for 30 minutes, and after 30 minutes of the run the sample is taken out and then it is washed under running water for 10 minutes until the soap solution is completely removed from the test sample. Afterwards, the stitches are removed on either side, that is the 2 longitudinal sides and 1 short side. On the 3 sides the stitches are removed, and 1 short side the stitches remain, and later the sample is being dried under normal temperature not exceeding 60 degrees centigrade, and later the sample is being tested using the grayscale standards. These are the common standards being developed which indicates the color change that is happened in the dyed material and color stain that happens in the white fabrics adjacent to the test specimen. So, this is how the color fastness to washing is done. Next, now we are going to learn about the color fastness to light. Majority of the coloring substances are sensitive to the UV rays present in the sunlight. So, fading occurs due to the continuous exposure of the colored fabrics to the sunlight. The consumer is often advised to dry the clothes in shade. This avoids any problem that may face due to the sunlight. A sunlight cabinet may be used as instrument to identify the color fastness towards the sunlight. It is a wooden box with a glass top having a stand. To test for fastness to light with fabric sample is half been covered with opaque paper and exposed to the outdoor light for 48 hours. Then comparison is made between both the halves, that is a dyed unexposed part and exposed part. If the exposed portion shows a comparatively fading, then fabric may be fast, is not fast to the light, otherwise it is good for sunlight fastness. This test can also be performed in testing laboratories by the use of instrument called fadometer. Fadometer is an apparatus having a very strong electronic lamps, that is generally xenon lamps or a carbon lamps are being used, and the samples are exposed into this light for 40 hours, and finally the sample will be graded by the use of the grayscale or a blue wool standards. And now we are going to see about the color fastness to crocking. So, crocking is nothing but the transfer of color by rubbing to the adjacent material. This generally happens with the apparel and as well as the upholstery that we use at homes as a home textiles. Dark shades are more likely to crock than the lighter shades because there is a tendency of the loose dye molecules to remain constant on the surface of the fabrics, and as well as printed fabrics have more tendency to crock than the dyed material. This is also same because on a printed material the dye remains on the surface of the textile material rather than entering inside as in the dyed material, and as well as this problem is also more intense in the wet fabrics. The wet fabrics crock easily compared to the dye fabrics because the moisture present is assist in removing the dye from the surface of the textile material. Color fastness to crocking is especially important for, as we have seen, more important to the apparels and upholstery. The device used for this test is called crockometer. This is a simple test procedure that even can be done at home also. This test determines whether or not color may be transferred from the surface of the dyed textile material or to the other materials by rubbing, or also the color change that happens with the dyed material. 2 specimens are being required to finish this test, one each for the dry material dry test procedure and one for the wet test procedure. The test specimen, generally longitudinal and lengthwise colored fabric is selected and it is placed on the base of the crockmeter, that is on the flat surface, and generally it is being abraded by using a white fabric, that is undyed fabric. So, this undyed fabric is held in the finger, that is extension that is happening on the top side of the crockmeter, and generally the colored material is being abraded or rubbed using this white fabric on the top side and having the 10 rotations per 1 second. So, generally 10 times at the rate of 1 turn per second is being done. The color change on the test specimen and staining on the white fabric is being tested. The test is repeated another time for the wet fabric also. So, by changing the dyed fabric as well as the changing the white fabric by wetting the white fabric. So, in this case also the color change and the color staining has been graded using the grayscale standards. And now we are going to learn about the color fastness to perspiration. Perspiration may change the color of the fabric. Perspiration may cause loosening of the some dye which may be transferred to the other parts of the same fabric and as well as onto the adjacent fabrics. So, this is the biggest problem when we wear clothes. So, in perspiration test, one or all these important things have to be considered, that is color change that happens with the dyed fabric, loosening or uneven redeposition of the color onto the same dyed material, and staining of the other materials in contact with the colored fabric. So, these are the 3 important factors that we have to consider while dealing with the color fastness to perspiration. Perspiration may be acidic or alkaline depending on the metabolic conditions of the human body and as well as the time of duration that is generally the material is being exposed for. A device is being used to test this color fastness and that is called perspirometer. The test procedure for this is as follows. For testing the dyed fabric for fastness to perspiration, we do require 2 samples. As we just discussed, the body may give alkaline or acidic perspiration depending on the metabolism of the body. So, obviously, we have to make 2 test samples which undergoes testing in 2 different solutions. Test specimen is prepared by cutting dyed fabric of 5 into 5 centimeter dimensions and sandwiching with white composite fabrics. And the test samples are soaked in both the solution, that is alkaline and acidic solution separately for 30 minutes. The excess solution is being squeezed off and the samples are being placed in between the acrylic plates of perspirometer, and this perspirometer will be placed in a hot air oven at 40 degrees Celsius for 5 hours. After that, the samples are being removed and the stitches are being removed on 3 sides and it is being dried at a room temperature, and the samples are being tested for alkaline and acidic conditions, are evaluated for both color change and color staining using grayscale standards. By now, you might have understood different test procedures are generally followed for color fastness test to washing, crocking as well as perspiration and sunlight. The test specimens are generally being evaluated using different test procedures. So, the test specimens are generally evaluated by following the standards laid by the different organizations. So, we have to decide which test procedure and evaluation procedure that we have to follow before the testing of the sample. So, there are different organizations which are being used for testing this color fastness. They include AATCC, that is American Association of Textile Chemists and Colorists, ASTM, American Society for Testing Materials, BIS, Bureau of Indian Standards, ISO, International Standards Organization. As per the standards, the color change in the dyed sample and color stain that happens to the adjacent fabrics are being evaluated by comparing the original dyed fabric and as well as the original white fabric that is being used in the test procedures. A standard scale called grayscale has been developed to guide the grading of the color fastness. According to the BIS, generally these are the procedures that we follow. So, when we have the grayscale in our hand and the test samples, that is a colored sample which is being tested and the white samples which is being undergone in the test procedures are being tested for their color change and color staining. So, generally there is a different gradings that is given on the grayscale. According to BIS, grayscale grades are interpreted for assessing the color fastness to washing, perspiration and crocking in terms of color change and color stain. For color change, grade 5 represents excellent, grade 4 represents good, 3 represents fair, 2 represents poor, 1 represents very poor. Similarly, for color stain, grade 5 indicates negligible or no stain, 4 indicates slightly stained, 3 indicates noticeably stained, 2 indicates considerably changed and 1 represents heavily stained. So, blue wool standards are the other standards that generally been followed to test the color fastness to sunlight. The blue wool standards of 1 to 8 grades are being exposed along with the test specimen to see the comparison between the test specimen and as well as the unexposed part of the original dyed material. There are different interpretations just like a grayscale standards, and this has 8 scaling. 8 indicates outstanding, 7 indicates excellent, 6 indicates very good, 5 indicates good, 4 indicates fairly good, 3 indicates fair, 2 indicates poor and finally 1 indicates very poor. So, if the sample is graded 9, it is having a good color fastness to sunlight, and if the sample is graded 1, it is having a very poor fastness to sunlight. And this is how the dyed samples and the stained samples are being evaluated using the grayscale and blue wool standards after the color fastness test procedures. By now, you might have understood the different test procedures generally followed for color fastness and the evaluation methods that is followed after color fastness. So, color, as we have learned, it is a very important to the consumer and as well as the textile designer who do the coloring. So, this all depends on the end use of the fabric for which the color or the material has been applied. Color contributes for making a fabric a bestseller in the market. How strong the fabric may be, how better the quality of the fabric may be, the consumer will select fabrics by seeing its color. Obviously, a textile designer should be very particular in selecting the particular colors to the textile material. Sometimes a poor quality fabrics may become the best seller in the market because of its attractive color. And not all the attractiveness of the color is permanent. So, this is a very prime factor that we have to understand while selecting the textile materials, because they may not be fast to the different conditions or to the end users. Most problems that consumers have with the textiles are problems of generally with the color, including fading due to sunlight. So, generally after washing we do dry clothes, or sometimes with the upholstery like curtains and all, when they are being exposed to sunlight they fade very badly. So, we have to select for this purpose the materials which are very good fast to sunlight. And similarly, bleeding or color fastness to washing is important problem with the apparels. So, one has to select those textiles which is having a good color fastness to washing and then can be used for apparels. In a similar way, there are materials which lose color due to crocking or rubbing. So, this happens with the apparel as well as upholstery, just like a seat covers or the seat bags. So, a consumer has to make a wide choice in selecting these materials while dealing with the different color fastness procedures or the test that is being laid. and of course, a knowledge will be given to the consumer in terms of label information. So, I think by now you understood the different test procedures and as well as evaluation methods and the importance of color fastness to the consumer as well as to the textile industry.